We've been talking about various forms of alienation and brokenness that come into our lives. We've also talked about God's mission of reconciliation in the world, a mission of reconciliation with God and with each other and with who God meant us to be. 2 sessions ago, I asked you to focus on one particular alienation and invited you to explore God's reconciliation in that area of your life. Last session was step 1, wanting reconciliation, being willing to let go of the pain. Today, I'd love to give you steps 2 to 4, except I don't know what they are. Every alienation is different. It involves unique people in unique circumstances. The steps that you take are probably completely different from the steps the person next to you will take. So instead, we're going to look at some areas to attend to, and then talk briefly about what the next step might look like. Previously, we talked about the idea that God is a reconciling God who wants to work reconciliation in your life, but only if you want it. That said, when it comes with reconciling with others, it's not enough to just want it. You're also going to have to work for it a little bit. So reconciliation becomes a joint project between you and the other person and God. You don't have control over what the other person is going to do. So today we're mainly going to focus on your work and the work of God. I'm going to use a fancy graphic to help structure the conversation. The first part of your work is introspection. That is taking a look at yourself. An interesting place to start is looking at your pain. Don't just look at the conflict itself, but rather how it makes you feel. For example, instead of just saying, "Bob always criticizes me," say, "When Bob criticizes me, it makes me feel like I'm not good enough." And then explore that a bit. Ask yourself why you're sensitive to that. Often our greatest pain comes not from without, but from within. So I might discover that long before Bob ever said a word, I already didn't feel good enough. My pain is that when Bob speaks, I feel like he's exposing something in me I'm desperately trying to hide, so I fight to keep it hidden. Now, I'm not saying those inner things are easy to fix, but it is going to help my relationship with Bob if I realize what part of the emotion is coming from inside me, not from Bob. Your pain never comes in isolation. It comes in the context of your whole history. Next, ask yourself how you're contributing to the problem. Pain and fear stir up all kinds of reactions, and most of them work against reconciliation. We'll do lots of things to avoid pain. One of the most common strategies is literally just avoid the other person. That might mean physical avoidance, or it might mean things like curtailing conversation. Other strategies include attacking the other person, or trying to lay guilt trips on them, or leveraging common relationships against them. Whatever they are, nobody takes pain lying down, so chances are pretty high that you have some things to work on. Not all your work is introspection. There's also, wait for it, extrospection. By the way, side note, this is why my wife hates playing Scrabble with me. I make up a word and then it turns out it's not made up at all. Extrospection is a real word that means look outside yourself. So it's not enough to only look inside yourself. You also need to look at the other person. Rather than waste time trying to list all the ways the other person is wrong, take some time trying to understand them. What pain are they experiencing? How is this making them feel? And here's the thing. Just like you, they've been shaped by all their experiences up till now. And this conflict is tapping into that other pain in their life. The point is not to justify their hostility, but to understand it, so that you can both work towards addressing the hurts you're causing each other and find reconciliation. As a side note, be careful in this step. Don't assume that you can figure them out from a distance. The goal here is not to figure them out, but to cultivate an empathetic and understanding spirit. Some of these questions will only be answered in conversation, but you have to enter the conversation looking for those answers. So those are some things that you can be looking to do. But the cool thing is, this doesn't all fall on you. God is at work in you. Look for that work. Sometimes we don't want to look for it because we know that God is a reconciling God, an enemy-loving God. But the work of God is not to make us do things we don't want to do. The work of God is to call us towards wholeness, towards well-being. God is working to heal us of the wounds in our lives. Corrie ten Boom was imprisoned in a Nazi concentration camp for helping Jews escape Germany. Years later, a guard came up to her and said, "I've become a Christian. God has forgiven me for the terrible things I've done. Will you also forgive me?" She remembered the terrible things he'd done, remembered that her sister had died in that camp. She realized that she couldn't forgive him. She didn't have what it takes. But she cried out to Jesus and said, "Jesus, help me. I can't forgive, but your love has been poured into me, and your love is greater than my hate." And she forgave that man, and that became an important part of her healing. Jesus' pain on the cross is greater than my pain, and so Jesus' love is greater than my love. When my love fails, Jesus' love will not. God is at work not just in you, but in them as well. In the midst of their pain and their hurt, Jesus is calling them towards reconciliation as well. Be on the lookout for the work of God in their life. That work might come through something you say. It might come through others. It might be the direct work of the Holy Spirit in their life. But God is at work. Now, that doesn't mean they're necessarily going to respond. God always leaves the response in our hands, and we regularly mess it up. But the simple act of looking for the work of God in their life will help you approach the relationship with a mind of reconciliation. And as you pray for the help that you need to reconcile, pray also for the help that they need. So there are some things to look at. Some in you, some in them. Some things for you to do, some things for God to do. So suppose you've sat in your room and done all this examining and looking. Now what? The first thing to realize is this: you have a choice. We spend most of our time thinking about what the other person should be doing differently in a conflict. But you can't control that, and if you focus on that, it's going to make you feel powerless in the conflict. So this is your choice. Are you going to let the pain control you? Because you get to decide how you're going to react to your pain. I'm not helplessly battered about by Bob's criticism. Instead of being controlled by the pain, I can choose to let it go and to forgive him and to turn myself over to the healing power of Jesus. I can choose to work for reconciliation. That work begins in earnest when you initiate reconciliation with the other person. But if the desire to reconcile is the hardest step, then this first motion towards the other person is the next hardest. The specifics are up to you. I find apologizing for my part in the process is often a pretty good way to open the dialogue. Acknowledge the pain that you've caused, admit your weakness, and say you're sorry. A couple of things I recommend against: don't try to explain your actions. It just sounds like you're either trying to justify them or minimize them, which is most likely exactly what you're doing. It often works against reconciliation. And don't expect reciprocation. It may take you a while to work up to reconciliation. It might take them a while too. So going back to last session, the first step is wanting reconciliation, believing that reconciliation is a part of God's plan for bringing healing into your life, believing that in forgiveness and reconciliation, you're going to find freedom and wholeness. Once you've decided to go for it, we talked about the fancy graphic. First, that you need to engage in introspection, examining your pain and what's behind it and what part you play in the conflict. Second, you can't control what they do, so at least seek to understand them and their pain. Third, God is at work in you, and God's love is greater than your hate and pain. Four, God is also at work in them, so look for it. Of course, none of this matters if you don't take concrete steps towards reconciliation with the other person. I want to leave you with this thought. There's a lot of self-help stuff out there. Most of it is fundamentally built on the principle that you can do it, that you have what it takes. I'm not so sure that's true. If I had what it takes, wouldn't I have already fixed it? But like Corrie ten Boom, I'm fully confident that even when I don't have what it takes, God does. Ultimately, it's the Holy Spirit who transforms our lives. Multiple times, Jesus connects our ability to reconcile with God's reconciliation. He says, freely give because freely you've received. He says, forgive because God has forgiven you. So if you want to be reconciled with others, then be reconciled with God. Spend time meditating on God's mercy in your own life and ask God to extend that same mercy through you towards others. If you take the time to really dwell in the richness of God's grace, God will be faithful in transforming your heart. God will still grant the other person the same choice you're granted. Maybe they'll respond to your olive branches, or maybe they'll use them for firewood. But your peace will no longer be dependent on them. Instead, as you faithfully place yourself in God's hands, the peace which passes all understanding will guard you, and you'll be free from the grip of alienation in your life.